Secretary Bunch, welcome. What an honor and a pleasure for me to have an opportunity to chat with you on a great occasion, the 50th anniversary of the school. Thanks for being with me.
Well, I'm so pleased, and I'll be with you as long as you call me Lonnie.
It's a deal. It's a deal. So let's begin by going backwards. 50 years ago, describe for me the atmosphere of the country. We'll talk a little bit about LBJ himself in a moment, but what was happening in the country? How were people feeling, and what were the sort of main topics that people were wrestling with?
Well, 50 years ago, there was a concern that the country was in disarray, um, that there were so many issues that were tugging at the soul of the country. So you have so many people concerned about the war in Vietnam. So there's a lot of pressure, a lot of angst, a lot of demonstrations. But then you also have moments like the killing of the students at Kent State and at Jackson State, which really made people feel that young America was under attack. Clearly, what you also have going on is the civil rights issues and the racial issues. You've got unrest in the cities. Even in 1970, smaller towns like Asbury Park, New Jersey, has an insurrection, a riot. And so, what you really are seeing are concerns about the future of the country, um, overwhelmingly concerned about international issues, and there is a great push and divide over whether or not protests are right or whether they really are something that needs to be countered by a law and order position.
Hmm. Lots of overlap with 2020, it sounds like.
It does seem
Um,
to me very similar.
well, were people anxious? I mean, how would you describe the populace? Anxious? And how was the economy? Were people feeling good about the economic direction the country was going in?
Well, on the one hand, there were several things that gave people hope. 1969, we made it to the moon. People were still on a sort of high based on that. You also had the continuing of the prosperity that occurred during most of the 60s, but it's beginning to sort of turn down. So while people are feeling good, there's angst. They're worried that the economy, as well as international issues, are going to bring the country down. And so I think that what you really have is a tipping point where people think something has to change. And the worry is either for the good or for ill.
Hmm. So that's the environment in which LBJ now is helping create this school. Well, tell me a little bit about how the public saw him specifically and how he saw his legacy of his time in the White House and what he thought his future might be on his way out.
Well, I think what's clear is that in 1964, LBJ has such support. And yet, by the time he leaves office, people are very critical of him. All the things that he did domestically were overshadowed by the international, by Vietnam. And so, what you see is people not realizing the importance of the work that he's done domestically. And what people are saying is he disrupted the country because of the war, the economy is starting to tank. In essence, there was a belief that LBJ hurt more than he helped. And I think that for LBJ himself, the great concern was to realize that he knew how important his domestic agenda was. And he hoped that would be his legacy. But clearly, Vietnam challenged that legacy.
It seems now, from a 2020 perspective, that that domestic legacy was able to break through, and all the value of some of the things that he accomplished domestically became not just critically important, but teed up so many other things that followed. So let's talk about that domestic legacy and when it became clear that those were so important for the direction the United States would take. What would you say is a defining piece of legacy that we should be talking about here?
Well, I think the notion of a great society, of Lyndon Johnson saying that America can be a nation that can live up to its ideals, that can be fair, that can provide economic opportunity for all. And when you look at what he accomplished domestically, very few presidents throughout American history have been able to do that. Whether it's the work in civil rights, I mean, let's be honest, the first time there was even a real attempt to do any civil rights legislation was when Johnson was in the Senate, and he championed the 1957 and 1960 legislation. But these were modest in scope. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was transformative. It really said that de facto segregation was not acceptable, and that African Americans had certain rights. The Voting Rights Act ensured that there would be opportunities for African Americans and others to have a voice in this government. Fair housing actions that he did were crucially important, but also beyond race. I mean, Medicare and Medicaid, his immigration reform that really allowed a fairer system to allow immigrants to enter into this country. In some ways, what I think is so powerful is that Lyndon Johnson had an important legacy, and that legacy is that a country can be made better when government interaction works with the sort of sense of the public. And I think in many ways, I can't think of anybody who had as big a domestic impact as Lyndon Baines Johnson.
On the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act back in 2014, President Obama said this: "Because of laws President Johnson signed, new doors of opportunity and education swung open for everybody. Not all at once, but they swung open." And he kind of ended that comment by talking about how they swung open for him as well, which led ultimately to him becoming president of the United States. When we think, though, about a lot of those things that you ticked off, those are things we're still not just talking about, but debating and legislatively are trying to undermine. What's happening in the country today that sort of all that other legislation has led to?
Well, I think, first of all, let's be clear. That legislation led to a different America, an America that was fairer and freer. No one can deny that. I think what the challenge is that there was a sense that the federal government was too active, too involved in changing, and wanted to sort of see it more hands off. And so you have this debate between what is the role of government in the economy, in the social and political sphere. And I think that Johnson had one pole, a kind of progressive government, and there are others who feel that the government should be laissez-faire, more hands-off. And I think that's the big debate that you see today. And then I think the challenge is also whether or not there's a belief that the ills of the 1950s and 60s have been taken care of. Do we still need the legislation to protect issues of race or issues of gender? And I think those are debates you see today. And they are really at the heart of what I would argue is a struggle for the soul of America.
You've said this: "We understand we are trapped in history only if we fail to learn from it." Tell me about the history that we have failed to learn from, and maybe more positively, some of the history that we have learned from and figured out as a society.
What we've learned in a positive way is that when people cross racial and political lines, that they can change a country, that they can help address ills that people never thought could be addressed. Candidly, people felt that segregation would always be part of American way of life, legal segregation. And that was changed because people came together. I think the downside is that what you see is where people are sort of no longer able to have clear conversations and debates, that in essence, people are saying there's no middle ground. And in some ways, the challenge of today, candidly, is to recognize the power of a positive government in people's lives is really what people are looking for. And the debate is, how active should that government be?
One of my favorite lines in your bio, it's insane, so I'm going to read it to everybody, and I know people already know this, but it goes like this. Bunch was the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. When he started as director in 2005, he had one staff member, no collections, no funding, and no site for a museum. So talk to me about those early days. What was the vision like? What was your idea of what a museum, much like a school, I think, right? There has to be a vision of like what the mission of this entity is. How did you see it?
Well, we called it the Museum of No, right? When we started. But we had a vision, and the vision was that history mattered, that understanding who we once were can help us better understand who we are today and could point us towards a better future. And the vision was really simple. It was that, on the one hand, America needed to confront its tortured racial past. It needed to remember. So we wanted to give America the opportunity to remember the good and the bad, the amazing achievement and the amazing tragedies. We also recognized that what we had was an opportunity to craft a museum that said, this is not a story about Black America for Black America. That in essence, African American history, in some ways, is the quintessential American story. It's a story that helps us understand the promise of America, and that we wanted everybody to realize that regardless of who they are, regardless of how long their family's been in this country, regardless of racial issues, they've been shaped by this story. So that dual vision of saying the Smithsonian is a place that people will come to grapple with issues that they didn't in the past, they will remember, and then to recognize that this is a story that was for us all, was what motivated us to move forward, to start from no, to ultimately get to, my God, what an opening in 2016.
And honestly, I mean, pre-coronavirus, I thought it was amazing to see giant lines, which sometimes was a bummer if you were hoping to get in that day, but also very diverse lines. You know, this idea that every person, tourists and Americans and white people and Black people and Asian people and Latino. I mean, I think it was just such a hugely popular place for people to learn about American history. How did LBJ feel about his legacy looking backward? And then what did he want to accomplish in his later days once he moved out of the White House?
I think that LBJ struggled with the notion of his legacy being colored solely by Vietnam. And I think that what he really wanted people to see was the domestic legacy, that he was able to build compromises, coalitions, things that people had not done effectively in the past were done in a way that allowed LBJ to sort of craft legislation that protected so many aspects of American life, whether it's wilderness or environmental issues or child care issues. So in a way, I think that he struggled to make sure that people didn't just think about Vietnam.
The school has been a very interesting vehicle, I think, for that. Stacey Abrams, who was an outstanding alum from the school, used to talk about, I'm going to paraphrase her so badly, but basically that you weren't, the mission and the ethos of the school was about acting and doing and accomplishing. It wasn't to sit around and ponder problems. You had to get out in society and actually do things. How does that fit with who LBJ was?
I think that is so powerful. In some ways, the school has really done a major service, which is building on LBJ's legacy to say that you can do good through public service, that the political arena is a place where dreams can be made real, a place where real tragedies can be prevented. And so I think in many ways, you see people coming out of the school in an activist bent. It's their job to use the tools they have, the training they've received to make a country better, to make a difference. And I think in a way, that was what would be making LBJ smile.
Hmm. Talk to me about how challenging a time it's been. I mean, 2020, that's an understatement. It's been challenging for everybody on every front. If you're a museum whose business is in bringing people en masse through the doors, it has to be incredibly difficult. And you, of course, oversee all of these museums. What's the strategy now? How are you serving people through museums when they can't actually come in the door?
So when they write my legacy, they'll say, oh, he's the guy that closed the Smithsonian. So that basically what I realized is that this moment meant buildings may close, but the Smithsonian has to be open. And so we pivoted virtually. Many museums around the world are doing that, are recognizing that more people, especially Americans, are more comfortable receiving content digitally than ever before. So let's do that. Let's give them the material they need. But also, we realized that we needed to help people educate their children. As teachers began to no longer teach, as parents became teachers, we realized that we had such amazing educational material from the arts, from science, from history, and we wanted the public to use that. So one was going virtual. Two, the other was recognizing that we have expertise that can help a country both understand the pandemic of the virus. We have people who can help us understand how viruses transfer from animals to humans and the like, but also we had people who could help us think about the challenge of race. And so it was really important for me and the Smithsonian to say, we're going to be a place that's of value right now. We're going to give you the opportunity to discuss issues that you traditionally don't want to discuss, but you will because it's the Smithsonian. So we really tried to do that. But it also meant that we recognized that we had to think about what does reopening ultimately mean, because you're ultimately going to reopen these buildings. And so we really had to ask ourselves the question is, what happens in museums that is so special is that you create informal communities. People walk to an artifact or an exhibition and start talking to the people they don't know. And the stories are amazing. So how do you create that informal community when you have to social distance? So we've thought a lot about, how to reduce the number of people who come into the building. So therefore we can social distance so you can still have those conversations. So that in essence, what we've done is said, look, it's a new time, it's a new day, and that we'll never go back to the way things once were. Let's use this to rethink so many things that we've done that maybe we can do better. I'll tell you my one big concern. The big concern is that technology has always been the way that we've made these stories accessible for people who have learning disabilities or like. So now are people going to want to touch screens? Are people going to want to do that? So it's really a challenge for us to think about what are the new technologies that will keep people safe and comfortable, but still allow us to be the accessible institutions we want to be.
It aligns a lot, I think, with the school, because this idea of you have to be relevant in this moment. And this moment is quite a chaotic moment with some very challenging issues and conversations to have. Has it been hard? I know that you've talked a lot about how you keep the tradition of the Smithsonian while also getting into some of these conversations that I think freak people out sometimes.
Well, it would be easy if I just said, let's talk about the panda. And that would make people comfortable. But I think that part of the key for me is what are the tools that you have as an individual or as an institution to help a country? And so I felt that it was crucially important for us not to sit on our hands and wait this out, but to really say, we can help craft material that teaches kids about COVID-19 and how to handle that. We can actually have conversations in Minneapolis or in St. Louis around issues of race. In essence, we can bring our expertise in science, in culture, and history and make it accessible to the public so that they can see the Smithsonian as someplace they trust, but as someplace that can help them get the tools they need to live their lives today.
You've said that Americans romanticize history. What do you mean by that?
In many ways, Americans are a historical people. They want to look at the myths. They want to celebrate those myths. And what my argument is that myths are crucially important, but myths aren't real history. When you look at things like the Confederate monuments, the conversation around why those monuments were even created, or they had less to do with the Civil War and more to do with sort of white supremacy. So part of what for me is, I think history is just the most amazing tool, this most exciting thing you can understand. And I want people to have that excitement, to grapple with the past in ways that are meaningful, that allow us to live our lives today. I want people to recognize that history gives us the best inspiration and challenges us to live up to our stated ideals, but it also gives us tools to understand what can happen when people come together and what can happen when they don't.
In your mind, and our final question, what do you think was LBJ's most important and enduring legacy? And it doesn't have to be an individual piece of legislation. It can be a mindset, it can be a philosophy. For you personally, what is the thing that you take away from what he was able to do and sometimes struggle to do in this country?
What LBJ did for me, looking back, is it made me realize that change is possible, that there were intractable issues, immigration issues, environmental issues. Johnson said, we can grapple with these. And so for me, it was less about, yes, he passed this legislation or that, and more about creating an atmosphere that says, we are responsible as a nation for the greater good of our people. That means we have to believe in things that people didn't think were possible. And Lyndon Johnson had the ability to both believe and to implement. What a skill.
Secretary Lonnie Bunch, what a pleasure for us to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's always my pleasure to be with you.